Imagine this. You are a woman, alone on a remote island in the Pacific. There is no city, no radio, no way to leave. Then one night, a ship is destroyed offshore. 32 soldiers swim to the island, exhausted, armed, still fighting a war they believe isn't over. You don't know if they see you as shelter, or as something else. Days pass. Weeks turn into months. The war ends. They don't believe it. No orders arrive. No rescue comes. And slowly, the island changes. Rules are made. Loyalties shift. Tensions rise. You are not a prisoner. But there is nowhere to run. This is not a legend. This actually happened. In the Pacific Ocean, far from the main shipping routes and thousands of kilometers from mainland Japan, there is a small volcanic island known as Anatahan. During the Second World War, Anatahan was not a major military base. There were no airfields, no permanent garrison, and no large installations. Instead, the island served a quieter purpose, a temporary stopover point for Japanese personnel moving through the region. It was remote, isolated, and easy to forget. At the time, only a handful of people lived there. Among them was a Japanese civilian woman named Kazuko Higa. Kazuko did not arrive on Anatahan by accident. She was there because of the war. She and her husband had been sent to the island as part of Japan's wartime logistics network. They were civilians, not soldiers, responsible for maintaining basic operations and supplies for passing vessels. Life on Anatahan was difficult but manageable. The island was small, heavily forested, and dominated by a volcanic interior. Fresh water was limited, communication with the outside world was unreliable, and supply ships arrived infrequently. Still, Kazuko was not alone. At first. Sometime after their arrival, Kazuko's husband died. Historical records describe his death as the result of illness or natural causes. There was no battle, no attack, just the quiet reality of living in isolation during wartime. With his death, everything changed. Kazuko was now the only woman on the island, and for a time, the only person. As the war continued, Anatahan slowly disappeared from attention. Japanese supply routes were disrupted by Allied forces, and ships stopped coming. Radio contact faded. The island became increasingly cut off from the outside world. Days passed with no news. Weeks turned into months. Kazuko survived by adapting to the island itself. She learned which plants could be used for food. She collected rainwater. She repaired what little equipment remained. There was no certainty of rescue. No clear timeline. Only routine and survival. Then, in 1944, everything changed again. Off the coast of Anatahan, a Japanese vessel was destroyed during an American attack. The ship did not sink quietly. It was sudden and violent. From that wreckage, 31 Japanese men survived. Some were soldiers. Others were technicians and support personnel. With nowhere else to go, they swam to the nearest land they could see. Anatahan Island. When they reached the shore, exhausted and injured, they did not find an empty island. They found Kazuko Higa. For the men, Anatahan was a place of refuge, a temporary shelter until rescue arrived. For Kazuko, it marked the end of her solitude and the beginning of a completely new reality. The island was no longer quiet. The men brought weapons. They brought military discipline. They brought the mindset of a war that, for them, was still ongoing. At first, there was cooperation. Food was gathered together. Shelters were built. A rough system of order was established. But Anatahan was never meant to support dozens of people for long periods of time. Resources were limited. Tensions grew. And beyond the practical challenges, there was another undeniable reality. Kazuko was now the only woman living among more than 30 men, isolated from the world, with no authority beyond what the group allowed. In 1945, the Second World War officially ended. Japan surrendered. But on Anatahan Island, the war did not end that day. The men did not believe the conflict was over. They dismissed Allied leaflets as deception. They believed surrender would mean execution or imprisonment. So they stayed. And as time passed, the isolation began to change them. What had started as survival slowly turned into something else, a fragile society shaped by fear, power, and prolonged confinement. This was only the beginning. When the group settled on Anatahan Island, survival came first. Shelters were reinforced. Weapons were secured. Food gathering became organized. At the beginning, the men worked together. They believed their stay would be temporary, just long enough for rescue to arrive. But rescue never came. Months passed, and the island began to change them. Anatahan was never designed to support a large group. Food was scarce. Fresh water was limited. Every resource had to be shared carefully. And as time passed, the men began to divide into smaller groups. Some tried to maintain military discipline. Others rejected authority altogether. Arguments became frequent, especially over food, labor, and leadership. At the center of this fragile balance was Kazuko Higa. She was not a leader in rank, but her presence carried weight. She was the only woman on the island, and in an isolated environment, that reality became impossible to ignore. Relationships began to form. Accounts from surviving men suggest that Kazuko formed personal relationships with some of the men over time. These relationships were not publicly defined, but they affected how power shifted within the group. Jealousy followed. Disputes that once centered on survival began to take on a different tone, more personal, more dangerous. Weapons that had been brought for defense were now part of internal tensions. In 1945, Allied aircraft flew over Anatahan. Leaflets were dropped, announcing that Japan had surrendered and the war was over. The message was clear. But the men did not accept it. They believed the leaflets were psychological warfare, a trap designed to lure them out. Decades of military conditioning made surrender unthinkable. So they stayed. As years passed, isolation deepened the divisions among them. Leadership changed hands multiple times. Some men attempted to impose strict rules, others resisted. Violence followed. Historical records indicate that several men were killed during this period. Some deaths were the result of direct conflict. Others were described as accidents, though circumstances were often unclear. What is certain is that Anatahan became increasingly unstable. Trust eroded. The group was no longer unified by survival alone. Fear and suspicion replaced cooperation. Throughout this period, Kazuko remained on the island. Her position was dangerous, not because of any single individual, but because of the environment itself, prolonged isolation, armed men, and the absence of outside authority. By the late 1940s, it was clear that the situation could not continue indefinitely. In 1950, an opportunity finally appeared. American forces made contact with the island again, this time successfully. Communication was established. Unlike the men, Kazuko accepted that the war had ended. She chose to leave. Her departure marked a turning point. Without her presence, the fragile social structure on Anatahan collapsed further. The men were forced to confront reality without the symbol that had shaped much of their internal conflict. One by one, they began to accept the truth. In 1951, the remaining men surrendered and were evacuated from the island. The Anatahan incident was over. What remained was not a story of heroes or villains, but a stark example of what prolonged isolation can do to people, especially when war, fear, and survival intersect. In the next part, we will examine what happened after Anatahan, how the world reacted, how the survivors were received, and how this story became one of the most unsettling chapters of the Pacific War. When the last men finally left Anatahan Island in 1951, the physical isolation ended. But the story did not. The survivors were taken back to Japan, where they expected relief, understanding, and perhaps sympathy. Instead, they were met with confusion, suspicion, and controversy. The war had been over for years. Japan had rebuilt itself around peace, reconstruction, and forgetting. The men from Anatahan returned as reminders of a past many wanted to leave behind. Their story did not fit neatly into heroism or defeat. They had not died for the empire. They had not surrendered when ordered. They had lived on an island where violence occurred long after the war officially ended. And at the center of public attention stood Kazuko Higa. Unlike the men, Kazuko had left Anatahan a year earlier. When she returned to Japan, her story spread quickly through newspapers and magazines. She was labeled many things. Some called her a survivor. Others called her a manipulator. Some went further, portraying her as the cause of the violence on the island. These narratives ignored an essential fact. Kazuko had lived for years in total isolation, surrounded by armed men, with no functioning authority, no law, and no possibility of escape. She had not created the conditions on Anatahan. She had endured them. The men told conflicting stories about what had happened. Accounts differed on relationships, responsibility, and blame. What was consistent, however, was the environment itself. Prolonged isolation, scarcity of resources, the constant belief that surrender meant death. Psychologists later noted that Anatahan was a textbook case of social breakdown under extreme confinement. Without external structure, power shifted unpredictably. Rules became personal. Violence became normalized. Kazuko's presence did not cause this breakdown. It simply became a focal point for tensions that already existed. In the years that followed, the Anatahan incident became the subject of books, essays, and films. In 1953, Japanese filmmaker Joseph von Sternberg directed a film titled Anatahan, based loosely on the events. The film portrayed the island as a place where desire and power overwhelmed reason. But like many dramatizations, it simplified a far more complex reality. The real Anatahan story was not about morality or scandal. It was about what happens when human beings are cut off from society for too long. War did not end on Anatahan when treaties were signed. It ended slowly, unevenly, and painfully. For Kazuko Higa, life after Anatahan was quiet. She avoided public attention and did not seek to profit from her story. For the men, reintegration was difficult. Some struggled with guilt, others with silence. None of them returned to normal life unchanged. Anatahan Island itself remains uninhabited today. The jungle has reclaimed what little was built. The shelters are gone. The paths have vanished. But the story remains. Not as a legend, not as a warning meant to frighten, but as a record of what prolonged isolation, fear, and war can do to ordinary people. This was not a story of villains and heroes. It was a story of humans pushed beyond the limits of structure, certainty, and control. And it happened. The war ended in 1945. On Anatahan Island, it took 6 more years for reality to finally arrive.